Hey guys, tonight we're about to time travel to a place so wild, so bizarre, and so entirely unmodern that you'll be grateful for your comfy sheets and Wi-Fi. We're diving into the world of ancient Rome, and not the glamorous version you see in movies. No, this is the real deal, where people ate with their hands, didn't bathe nearly enough, and the notion of privacy was, well, laughable. Tonight, we're talking about what it was really like to be a prostitute in ancient Rome. And before you jump to conclusions, let me assure you, it's not as fun as those toga parties might have you believe. So before we get into all of this, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, right? Now dim the lights, turn on a fan, get comfy, and maybe tuck your feet in so the imaginary rats can't nibble on them. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a Roman prostitute? How much did they actually get paid? Did they have an office or just stand on street corners? Did they have business cards? What did their daily life look like in a city that had about as many public baths as it did public scandals? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1st century Rome. The smell of the streets is enough to make you gag, but you've got to make a living. Good luck. The sun beats down on the cobblestones of ancient Rome, and if you're standing on a street corner, you know exactly what that means. Business? But not just any business, business of the most personal kind. Prostitutes in ancient Rome didn't have to deal with Yelp reviews or Google ratings, but they had their own unique challenges, like being on the street, dealing with all sorts of uninvited customers, and pretending to be cheerful while the air smelled like, well, let's not get into that. You might stand there on your feet for hours with the knowledge that in the heat of the midday sun, you're about to meet a mix of drunken soldiers, disinterested philosophers, and the occasional overly enthusiastic merchant. If you were a prostitute in ancient Rome, your office was the street corner, a brothel, or even the market square. And while some may have worked in a luxurious house or the relative safety of a designated brothel, many of Rome's streetwalkers had a far less glamorous existence. Imagine standing there in a dusty toga, or perhaps a simple tunic, trying to catch the attention of potential customers while avoiding the smell of roasted meat, animal waste, and, well, the occasional vomit from last night's banquet. It wasn't pretty, but it was business. You had to be approachable, charming even. A quick flash of the eyes, a casual touch on the shoulder, or a wink could be enough to seal the deal for the day. In the world of ancient Rome, most prostitution wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't about love. It was about survival, status, and keeping the lights on. Sure, there were wealthier, higher-class courtesans who worked in luxury, entertaining the rich and powerful. But for the majority of Roman prostitutes, it was a grind. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for clients to come to them. They had to be available, on call 24/7. And while we tend to think of prostitutes as offering their services exclusively in secret or dark corners, this wasn't the case in Rome. Sex work was woven into the very fabric of Roman society, acknowledged by most and even regulated by the government. There were legal brothels and even designated areas where street prostitutes could ply their trade openly. Still, if you were one of these women, you were constantly dealing with the noise, the distractions, and the occasional disrespectful customer who had no qualms about using your services in broad daylight. But business was a dance, wasn't it? A very odd, very ancient waltz of power, trade, and necessity. Let's not forget, many Roman prostitutes were slaves, meaning their business wasn't really a choice. But even if you were a free woman, the street was the only office you had. Could you imagine negotiating rates on a busy Roman street corner while trying to avoid being elbowed by a soldier's sword or knocked over by a donkey cart? Not exactly the most calming environment to conduct business, but it's exactly what you had to do if you wanted to eat. And let's not forget about the competition. You weren't the only one standing on that corner. There were others, just as desperate, just as determined. So what did you have to do to stand out? Well, you needed something that caught the eye, whether it was a striking hairstyle, bright jewelry, or perhaps a particular scent, which, trust me, you needed in that heat. You had to make sure you were noticed. It was a delicate balance. Too much, and you'd look like you were desperate. Too little, and you'd blend into the background like one of the many other faceless women trying to survive. And then, just when you thought things couldn't get any more bizarre, the reality of the purchasing aspect of the whole situation set in. We've all seen Roman baths in movies, right? Luxurious and relaxing, with steam and candles. But in reality, some of those baths were also places where you'd work. Imagine sitting next to a sweaty soldier, listening to his boast about his latest battle while you try to keep your composure and look interested. Business was everywhere, in every corner of Rome, and for a prostitute, your office was wherever you could find someone willing to pay. In many ways, the streets of Rome were as much about survival as they were about a chance to earn a living. There was no real job security for Roman prostitutes, but they did have one thing going for them. The Roman world, despite its problems, had an abundance of men who needed their services, and you were, at the very least, someone who could provide them. The streets, the brothels, and the market squares, they were your battlefield, your territory, and your livelihood all wrapped into one messy, sweaty package. And trust me, no amount of perfume could mask the reality of that. When it came to beauty, the Romans had some odd ideas. Women were expected to maintain an appearance that would make modern beauty standards look like child's play. Heavy makeup, elaborate hairstyles, and certain body modifications were just the beginning. And as a prostitute in ancient Rome, looking good wasn't optional, it was your entire business. Did they use makeup made from lead? Possibly. Did they slather on perfumes to mask the smell of public toilets? Definitely. Now imagine this. You're standing on a street corner, trying to make a living in ancient Rome. But looking good wasn't just about a fresh coat of lipstick or having clean hair. No. It was about transforming yourself into something otherworldly. You had to be not just a person, but an ideal. In a world that valued aesthetics above almost anything, you had to make sure you looked as desirable as possible. The Romans didn't just want beauty, they wanted art, something crafted and curated. So in a city full of marble statues and glittering mosaics, you had to somehow make sure you lived up to the expectations that were set for you. And those expectations, well, let's say they were complicated. First, there were the famous hairstyles. Roman women spent hours every day carefully arranging their hair into the most elaborate styles imaginable. We're talking braids upon braids, twists, curls, and sometimes, if you were really lucky, ornate gold accessories to hold everything in place. If you were a prostitute, you probably didn't have the luxury of a personal stylist, but you sure tried your best. After all, Your hair was a symbol. It wasn't just about keeping it out of your face. It was about showing the world you had value, that you were a person of worth, not just a woman of the streets. So what did you do? You put your hair in the highest, most impressive style you could manage, and you prayed it didn't fall apart halfway through your shift. And let's not forget about the makeup. Roman beauty routines were like something out of a horror movie. Imagine painting your face with heavy, thick layers of white, lead-based powder to achieve that porcelain look. Was it dangerous? Absolutely. But beauty was a sacrifice, wasn't it? Lead was toxic, sure, but the Romans didn't exactly have skincare blogs telling them to avoid it. Instead, they leaned into their idea of perfection, no matter the cost. So you'd paint your face white, darken your eyebrows with burnt wood soot, and add a dab of red ochre to your lips, just enough to make your mouth look like it was always smiling, even if you didn't feel like it. Now, on top of the makeup, you had to smell good. I mean, let's face it, a life spent on the streets, dealing with Rome's open-air markets, animals, and let's not forget the public toilets, wasn't exactly going to leave you smelling like roses. So the Romans went all in on perfumes, so much so that they'd drench themselves in it to cover up the stink. But this wasn't your average rose-scented body spray. Oh no, this was a concoction of overpowering oils and incense, usually made from expensive ingredients like myrrh and frankincense. As a prostitute, you had to mask the underlying smells of city life because, let's face it, nobody wants to pay for a service if they think you might smell like yesterday's fish market. But here's the kicker. Even if you had the perfect look and the perfect scent, that didn't guarantee success. Why? Because the Romans also loved to judge, and they judged hard. The ideal Roman woman had to be beautiful, yes, but she also had to fit into very specific cultural ideals. And those ideals? Well, they didn't leave much room for individuality. If you were a prostitute, you had to walk a fine line between looking like you were worthy of a wealthy client's attention, but also making sure you didn't look too high class. If you looked too fancy, you might be seen as out of place. If you looked too poor, well, that wasn't going to attract much business either. It was a delicate dance of just right. And let's not forget the actual body modifications that many Roman women, including prostitutes, underwent. For example, some women underwent treatments to elongate their necks or achieve the ideal waistline. While these were often more popular among the upper class, prostitutes were sometimes forced to undergo similar beauty treatments to compete for the attention of wealthy clients. Some women went so far as to bleach their skin to achieve a lighter, more desirable tone. These practices were both painful and in some cases life-threatening, but in the pursuit of perfection, Roman women didn't hesitate to sacrifice their health for beauty. But here's the twist. Despite all these efforts, no amount of lead-based makeup, hairstyling, or perfume could mask the underlying truth. Beauty in ancient Rome wasn't just skin deep. It was about how you played the game. As a prostitute, it wasn't about looking perfect. It was about looking desirable enough to make a living. It was a constant juggling act, where even the smallest misstep could mean a day spent without customers, or worse, being judged as unworthy of attention. But as the Romans knew, if you played the game right, you could make a killing, even if it was all based on something as fleeting as beauty. So as you think about the level of care and effort it took to maintain such an appearance, you can only imagine how it felt to have all that work undone by a single bad day or a particularly dirty client. But hey, At least you could always count on the perfume to mask everything else. Imagine waking up to the sounds of the bustling market, the smells of roasting meat and garbage, and then realizing, oh right, I have to go to work. This wasn't your average 9 to 5. Roman brothel workers had to deal with all sorts of characters, some expected, some definitely unexpected. The life of a prostitute in ancient Rome wasn't all luxury and pleasure. It was, for the most part, a grind, literally. And I don't just mean the long hours standing on the corner or laying on the bed. We're talking about the emotional and physical toll of the job, too. Let's set the scene. It's early morning, and you've just woken up in your shared, cramped quarters, probably near some other workers, all of you trying to shake off the remnants of a long, tiring day. There's no warm cup of coffee or soft pillow to help ease the transition. You're lying on a straw mattress, the kind that's as uncomfortable as it sounds. But hey, at least it's your mattress for the day, unless it's your turn to sleep in the communal area where the others have left behind their own share of dirt. If you're lucky, you've managed to get a couple hours of sleep, but your job is about to begin. You hear the street vendors shouting in the distance, the donkeys braying as they haul goods to market, and the sounds of the Roman city coming to life. And then, there it is, the unmistakable smell of the city's open sewer system. But you can't just lie there. You can't even enjoy a long stretch before you head to work. No, instead, you're thinking about how your day's going to go, and whether you'll get enough clients to make ends meet. The streets of Rome are always busy, but not always with customers. As a prostitute, you didn't get the luxury of a set schedule. The day ahead could bring anything from a steady stream of customers to an awkward standoff with a rowdy soldier. The brothel you work at may offer some shelter, but you're not in control of your own space. If you're a low-class prostitute, your job means staying in a filthy room with no privacy, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the city. The better brothels might have at least a room to yourself, well, until it's time for the next customer. And even that comes with its own set of problems. Working as a brothel worker meant never being truly alone, not even for a moment. You'd share space with other women, and while that might have been a good thing in some ways, it also meant having to constantly watch your back. Jealousy and competition were a part of the daily grind as you tried to earn your place in the brothel hierarchy. So what was your typical workday like? It was never predictable, but it always started the same way, by getting yourself ready for the day. You'd probably spend a good amount of time applying your makeup. Forget about natural beauty. This was ancient Rome, where the idea of a natural look didn't exist. You needed to paint yourself into an ideal, using the same lead-based makeup and overpowering perfumes that could mask the smell of the street, the stench of the brothel, and, well, your client's odor too. You had to look the part. In fact, the more beautiful you looked, the better your chances of getting clients. And if you didn't look glamorous enough, well, you could always rely on your charm to reel them in. Or not. Once you were ready, it was time to start the workday. Customers trickled in, and you had to maintain a false smile, greeting each one with an air of practiced indifference. Some would be the usual types: grumpy soldiers, drunk merchants, and the occasional nobleman. And while you had no say in who entered, you did have the ability to provide them with what they were looking for, whether it was companionship, a moment of escape from their worries, or just a quick bit of relief. As you moved through the day, you'd deal with your share of weird requests. Ancient Roman men didn't exactly have a reputation for being subtle, so you could expect anything from a man who insisted on performing bizarre rituals to one who simply wanted you to sit there and look pretty. And all of this happened in a world where boundaries didn't really exist, where everything was transactional and your emotions were never part of the deal. It was a role you had to play, and the more detached you could be, the better. But the grind wasn't just physical, it was mental too. Every client, every interaction chipped away a little more at your soul. Did you ever wonder what they saw when they looked at you? Did they just see a body? Were they aware of the person underneath? And while you couldn't ask those questions, who had time for self-reflection when you were constantly trying to make enough money to eat and survive? You couldn't help but wonder, deep down, if anyone would ever see you as something more than a transaction. As the sun began to set, your day was far from over. Clients may have slowed down, but your shift never really ended. Your work could carry on well into the evening, sometimes all through the night. You'd rest briefly, but the work was always in the back of your mind. This wasn't just a day job, it was a life. And so, in a society where your worth was often measured by your looks, your ability to cater to men's needs, and your endurance, the life of a brothel worker in ancient Rome was, for better or worse, a constant cycle of survival. Whether it was the constant noise of the streets or the emotional toll of the job, it was a grind, one that never seemed to end. We often hear about Roman nobility lounging on lavish couches and eating grapes. But what about the women who were supposed to entertain them? Did Roman prostitutes get to enjoy the same luxurious lifestyle? Or were they just the entertaining furniture of the Roman Empire with a salary that could barely buy a loaf of bread? In short, was it worth it? The answer might surprise you. In the grand scheme of things, living as a prostitute in ancient Rome didn't exactly involve reclining on plush cushions and sipping wine from golden goblets. Oh sure, the wealthy men who visited the brothels may have enjoyed their luxurious surroundings, but for the women providing the entertainment, not so much. Despite being part of a culture that celebrated excess, opulence, and indulgence, a prostitute's life was hardly ever about enjoying those same privileges. The world of Roman brothels, for the most part, was one of harsh realities and little reward. First off, let's talk about what these so-called luxuries actually looked like. In the higher-end brothels, where wealthy men came to enjoy the services of high-class courtesans, you might expect things like tapestries, gold-embroidered cushions, and fine food and drink. But was this what the prostitutes actually got to enjoy? Not really. These luxuries were more for the pleasure of the men who paid for the services. If you were a prostitute in these places, your job wasn't to lounge around in luxury. It was to be the centerpiece of the room, like an ornament to be admired and used. While the men sipped wine and enjoyed their food, you were there to fulfill their desires, not partake in their pleasures. And let's be honest, you weren't getting a piece of that luxury pie, you were just the slice on the plate. In fact, many of these high-end brothels were run by wealthy, powerful men who treated the prostitutes more like commodities than actual people. While they got the benefits of wealth and status, the prostitutes had little to show for it. Sure, you might wear a fancy gown or have a beautiful hairstyle, but what you wore didn't translate into personal wealth. A day's worth of customers could earn you just enough to scrape by, but it wouldn't get you a penthouse suite or an evening of luxury in Rome's most exclusive baths. On the flip side, for lower-class prostitutes working in the streets or small, less glamorous brothels, the situation was even worse. These women were expected to be on their feet for hours, constantly dealing with rowdy customers and being paid little in return. A few coins here and there might have been the most you could hope for. While the rich men indulged in pleasures, you were left with the grueling task of getting through the day just to survive. Forget about lounging around. This life was all about survival, plain and simple. Your earnings barely covered food, much less the ability to live any sort of luxury life. And then there was the issue of health. Luxury wasn't just about having fancy things. It was also about staying healthy, right? Well, good luck with that. Prostitutes in ancient Rome, particularly those working on the streets or in lower-class brothels, faced an increased risk of diseases and infections, something that the upper classes didn't often have to worry about. With poor sanitation, no antibiotics, and limited access to health care, your health was constantly at risk. In this context, luxury didn't mean a soft pillow and a warm bath at the end of the day. It meant surviving without succumbing to illness. Of course, the perception of luxury wasn't just about what you could buy. It was about status. For high-class courtesans, the idea was to be seen and admired. You were expected to be the embodiment of Roman ideals of beauty and sophistication, but at what cost? The pressure to maintain a flawless appearance, to wear expensive perfumes, and to entertain men could take a toll on your mental and emotional well-being. You may have worn the finest clothes and lived in a beautiful house, but were you truly free? Were you happy? In many ways, the luxury of your life was a mask, hiding the reality that for the most part, you were there to entertain and be used, not to live a carefree, indulgent life. And finally, let's talk about freedom. The men who visited the brothels were free to come and go as they pleased. They didn't have to worry about their safety or their livelihood. They were in control. But for the prostitutes, especially those who were slaves or had little choice in their work, their lives were controlled by others. The so-called luxury of being a courtesan or a brothel worker came with strings attached, strings that kept you bound to the whims of the powerful men who paid for your services. So, was it worth it? If you were lucky enough to land in a high-end brothel, you might have had access to a somewhat cushy life, but even that came with a price. If you were on the streets or working in a smaller brothel, luxury wasn't even a word in your vocabulary. It wasn't the life of indulgence and extravagance that many modern people imagine when they think of Roman prostitutes. It was a life of survival, a constant struggle for safety, health, and basic needs. Luxury? Well, that's a relative term in ancient Rome, and for most Roman prostitutes, it was a distant dream, not a reality. When we think of ancient Rome, we might picture lavish banquets and luxurious palaces. But when it comes to the financial compensation for Roman prostitutes, things were a bit more modest. Sure, you might have a few wealthy patrons, but for the most part, your pay probably didn't stretch much further than a few coins, or at best, a nice meal. So, was it worth the price of admission? In the glamorous fantasy of ancient Rome, it's easy to imagine Roman prostitutes raking in stacks of coins, living the high life alongside emperors and gladiators. But the truth, not so much. In reality, the financials were far less rosy. For the majority of Roman prostitutes, the compensation for their work was more a matter of survival than luxury. If you were one of the streetwalkers or low-ranking brothel workers, you weren't looking at hefty payouts. Instead, you were likely making just enough to scrape by. A few coins here, a loaf of bread there, and maybe, if you were really lucky, a nice meal to get you through the day. Now imagine the job. You're standing on a street corner, working in the brutal sun, dodging the noise and stink of the marketplace, hoping that one of the wealthy men you've caught the eye of might actually stop. That's the thing about being a prostitute in ancient Rome. Your income was entirely dependent on how many clients you could attract and how much they were willing to pay. On a good day, you might make enough to buy a hot meal and maybe even pay for a roof over your head. On a bad day, you were left with nothing but the knowledge that you'd have to do it all again tomorrow. The truth is, even though prostitution was a common and accepted part of Roman society, it wasn't exactly a booming business for the women involved. Wealthy patrons, senators, generals, and other high-class men might have paid more for their pleasure, but their visits were fewer and farther between. Prostitutes working for these men might receive better pay and possibly more favorable treatment, but their lives were still largely dictated by the whims of these men. And then, of course, there was the issue of taxation. Yes, you heard that right. Roman prostitutes were taxed, and not in the way you might think. The government had no problem profiting off of prostitution. The brothels themselves were taxed, which meant that brothel owners passed those costs onto the women who worked there. If you were lucky, a good day's work might cover your daily expenses and leave you with a few extra coins. But for the most part, a prostitute's earnings were barely enough to keep the wolves at bay. Most of your income would go toward paying off the brothel's rent or taxes, leaving you with just enough to buy food, or maybe a little something extra if you were lucky. For the women who worked as slaves in brothels, the situation was even worse. They didn't even get the chance to pocket any of their earnings. As slaves, they were entirely dependent on their masters for everything. Whatever they earned went straight into their owner's hands, and they were left with only the barest of essentials. For these women, there was no chance of saving money or building a future. It was a life of servitude, both physical and financial. It's hard to imagine anyone thriving under such circumstances, but that was the reality for many of these women. And what about the women who worked in the upper-class brothels or as elite courtesans? They might have been able to command higher prices, but they too were part of a system where their earnings were still controlled by the men who paid for their services or owned the brothels. These women might have had a more luxurious lifestyle compared to their counterparts working in the streets, but their work came with its own set of problems. Constant pressure to maintain their beauty, to entertain powerful men, and to keep their social status intact. In terms of financial compensation, the differences between a prostitute's life and that of an upper-class Roman woman were stark. While a noble woman had the ability to inherit property, manage wealth, and control her finances, the prostitute had none of these privileges. Your income was dependent on your looks, your charm, and your ability to attract the attention of the men who paid for your services. There was little to no room for advancement, and while some prostitutes might have managed to save up enough money to retire, that was a rare outcome. For the most part, they spent their days fighting to survive, one client at a time. So was it worth the price of admission? If you were a prostitute in ancient Rome, the answer was probably no. Sure, you could survive, but thriving wasn't in the cards for most. Whether you worked on the streets or in the back rooms of a brothel, you were in a profession that came with few rewards and a great deal of risk. Your pay didn't come close to matching the hard work and personal sacrifice required, and when you factored in the risks to your health, your safety, and your dignity, it's hard to say that the job really paid off. In the end, prostitution in ancient Rome may have been a job, but it certainly wasn't the kind of work that promised a comfortable life. Instead, it was a constant struggle, a daily grind to make ends meet, with little hope for anything better. The pay was modest, at best, and the costs were steep. So next time you think of lavish Roman feasts and grand palaces, remember that there were many in Rome who never got to enjoy those luxuries. They were too busy just trying to survive. Yes, you heard that right. In ancient Rome, brothels were taxed. That's right. The Roman government was getting a cut of your business transactions. Imagine that. Your workday already full of unwanted attention and bizarre demands, and on top of it, you had to deal with the taxman. Talk about a double whammy. Prostitution in ancient Rome, though generally accepted, was hardly a free-for-all. It was regulated, controlled, and taxed in a way that made sure the government got its share. So while the men enjoying the services of the prostitutes were paying for their pleasure, the women involved in the business had to make sure they weren't caught in the government's tax net. Not only were they trying to earn enough to survive, but they were also trying to dodge a hefty share of their earnings, going straight into the hands of the tax authorities. Imagine trying to make a living while knowing that a portion of your income was going to be taken out of your hands by someone who likely didn't even care about your well-being. How did the Roman government tax brothels? It wasn't subtle, that's for sure. If you worked in a brothel, you were subject to a tax based on the earnings of the brothel. This meant that the brothel owner, who had a vested interest in making sure the business stayed profitable, would be responsible for paying these taxes. But as you might expect, the brothel owners didn't just cough up the cash without passing some of the cost down the line. And who do you think bore the brunt of that? The prostitutes themselves, of course. The wages of these women, already modest at best, were often reduced even further to account for the cost of this business tax. Brothels were required to register with the government, which doesn't sound like the ideal setup for a profession that thrived on secrecy. Once the brothel was registered, the owners had to report their earnings. The taxes themselves were structured in a way that took into account how many workers were employed, as well as the overall income of the establishment. This meant that larger brothels, which often had more prostitutes and more clients, would have to pay a larger share of taxes. But that didn't mean that the smaller, street-based brothels or independent workers had it any easier. Everyone was taxed, no matter the size of the operation. So while the taxes were a way for the government to regulate the industry, they also became a burden for the women trying to survive within it. Imagine going to work every day, putting up with the bizarre and often degrading demands of your clients, all while knowing that a good chunk of what you earned was going straight to the state. You might have been able to keep a few coins in your pocket at the end of the day, but it wasn't much, certainly not enough to live comfortably. And the taxman, always lurking in the background, wasn't exactly sympathetic to your plight. There was no excuse or leniency for women working in the profession. If the taxman came knocking, you paid, whether you had the money or not. And if you didn't pay, there were penalties. If you were a prostitute in ancient Rome, you had to deal with the fact that your earnings were a commodity for everyone. The government wanted its cut, the brothel owner wanted their share, and the men who used your services were under no obligation to treat you with any real dignity. They could take, but the government could take more. The financial pressure from all sides must have been enough to make anyone wonder whether it was even worth getting out of bed. After all, at the end of the day, most of the women working in brothels were just trying to survive, not thrive. Survival meant meeting the demands of clients, dealing with constant judgment, and yes, paying the tax man. And don't forget about the very real possibility that the taxes didn't just affect your earnings. For some, it meant working longer hours or taking on more clients just to make sure that there was enough left to pay the tax. Even those in higher-end brothels who were perhaps able to earn a bit more faced the same system, forced to deal with the fact that no matter how many coins they made, a portion of it would be taken away. It was the price of doing business in ancient Rome. To make matters worse, there were no real guarantees that this money would go toward anything that would benefit the people who were paying it. Rome, like many empires, wasn't exactly known for its benevolence when it came to the treatment of its lower-class citizens. So the taxes that were levied on brothels and prostitutes were just another part of the dehumanizing structure that supported the empire. You might have been a worker in the Roman system, but you certainly didn't have any say in how the system treated you. So the next time you hear about the luxury of being a prostitute in ancient Rome, remember that for most, the price wasn't just about what you charged your clients. It was about the system that kept taking, over and over again. The taxman, the brothel owner, the customers, each one with their hand out, leaving you with just enough to survive, but never enough to escape. The price of doing business wasn't just financial, it was everything. If you think that Roman prostitutes were all statuesque beauties with flowing hair and flawless complexions, think again. In reality, most prostitutes in ancient Rome were just trying to survive. Many were slaves, and while some may have had the luxury of choosing their profession, most were simply doing what they had to in order to make a living. And no, they didn't look like the Roman version of Hollywood stars. The image of a glamorous courtesan, lounging in silk robes, wearing golden jewelry, and always looking camera-ready, is largely a creation of modern imagination. Sure, some women in Rome, especially those working in elite brothels, might have had the opportunity to enhance their appearance with jewelry, makeup, and fine clothing. But for the vast majority of prostitutes, appearance wasn't about glamour, it was about survival. The reality of their lives meant that they were often less concerned with the beauty standards we associate with the profession today, and more focused on getting by in a harsh, unforgiving world. Many of the women who found themselves in prostitution were slaves, traded, bought, and sold by their masters. They weren't living a life of choice. They were forced into the profession, whether they liked it or not. As slaves, these women didn't get to pick their outfits, their hairstyles, or their makeup. They didn't have the freedom to express their identity or try to maintain a personal standard of beauty. Instead, they were subjected to whatever their masters demanded of them. Their bodies were seen as commodities, and any beauty they might have had was simply a tool to make money for their owners. Those who worked in the streets or less luxurious brothels weren't given the luxury of styling themselves like the wealthy women of Rome. They didn't have access to expensive cosmetics, perfumes, or hairdressers. Their beauty was something more pragmatic. They had to look attractive enough to lure in clients, but they couldn't afford the luxury of beauty treatments. Most of these women didn't have access to high-end beauty products. If they used makeup at all, it was often homemade, made from substances that weren't exactly good for the skin, things like lead-based powders or coal soot for darkening eyebrows. The results? Not so much glowing, flawless skin, but something more like a patchwork of quick fixes, barely concealing the hard life these women led. And as for their hair, well, forget about the flowing locks you see in the movies. Roman prostitutes, especially those working in the lower-tier brothels or on the streets, had to make do with what they had. While wealthy Roman women could afford to have their hair styled by professionals, most prostitutes did their best with what they could manage. Perhaps they styled it simply, in a bun or braid, or if they had a little more time and resources, they might have gone for something more elaborate. But regardless of their hairstyle, it wasn't about beauty, it was about practicality. There was no time to spend hours on hair maintenance when you were working in the streets, dealing with multiple clients every day. The reality of a Roman prostitute's appearance was not about perfection, but about doing whatever it took to survive. A prostitute had to look good enough to attract the attention of potential clients, but that didn't mean she was focused on looking flawless. Her focus wasn't on maintaining an image of beauty for beauty's sake. It was on being functional and efficient in an unforgiving environment. If you were a slave, you didn't have the luxury of self-expression or individual style. Your looks were meant to serve a singular purpose, to bring in clients, to make money, to survive another day. Even the women who weren't slaves, those who may have chosen prostitution out of necessity or due to limited options, weren't living the glamorous lives that we might imagine when we think of ancient courtesans. Sure, they might have had a little more freedom, but they were still bound by the same societal pressures to maintain a certain appearance. Their beauty was just another tool, another resource that had to be managed carefully. You didn't have the luxury of looking unpolished in a society that placed so much value on appearance, but at the same time, you didn't have the resources to maintain a picture-perfect image either. So what did Roman prostitutes really look like? They weren't the glowing, flawless women we see in movies or think about when we imagine historical beauties. Instead, they were survivors, women who did their best to stay alive in a brutal, demanding world. They were a mix of practicality and necessity, with little room for self-expression beyond what was required to make it through another day. Their beauty, if you could even call it that, wasn't about being aesthetically perfect. It was about being functional enough to meet the needs of their clients and the demands of a society that used their bodies as a commodity. If you think your workplace has strange rules, just imagine trying to work under Roman law as a prostitute. Not only were there strict regulations on where and how you could work, but certain Roman laws were specifically designed to keep prostitutes in their place, literally. For example, women were forbidden from wearing any clothes that might show off their trade in public. And yes, there were even laws about what kind of shoes they could wear. You might think that, in a society as large and diverse as ancient Rome, anything could go. After all, Rome was known for its decadence and opulence. But when it came to prostitution, the rules were anything but relaxed. Roman authorities were keen on regulating, controlling, and categorizing prostitution in ways that reflected the empire's obsession with order, control, and class distinctions. It wasn't just a matter of staying out of sight. Prostitutes were expected to comply with a set of social norms that could mean the difference between staying out of jail or being punished for perceived immorality. Let's start with the dress code. You could be a prostitute in ancient Rome, but you better make sure your attire didn't advertise it too boldly. There were explicit laws that regulated what prostitutes could wear. If you were in the streets, you had to dress modestly, no revealing tunics or flashy clothing that would give away your profession. Sounds strange, right? After all, you were technically working in public, but you had to maintain a certain level of discretion. If you wore clothes that openly identified you as a prostitute, you were essentially putting yourself at risk of being branded as a criminal or publicly shamed. Why? Because Rome's laws were designed to maintain a strict social order, and the last thing the government wanted was for prostitutes to be too out in the open. They were considered essential to society's function, but only if they were kept at arm's length. Prostitutes who wore more ostentatious clothing, anything that hinted at their profession, such as certain kinds of dresses or jewelry, could be fined or punished. It was a strange paradox. The system used you, but it didn't want you to be too visible. You had to balance on a tightrope between staying in business and staying under the radar. And it didn't stop at clothing. Oh no, the Romans had a whole set of rules governing your behavior. One of the most famous or infamous regulations had to do with footwear. Prostitutes were required to wear specific kinds of shoes. Why? Because apparently the Roman authorities felt that the right kind of shoes could keep prostitutes from being too promiscuous or disruptive. Yes, it's true. Women in the profession had to wear a certain type of shoe, nothing too flashy or overly fashionable. A prostitute's footwear had to reflect the appropriate level of respectability. It wasn't enough to just be in the game. You had to dress like you were still a part of the lower class, but just barely. In fact, the entire notion of public respectability was a huge part of the laws surrounding prostitutes in Rome. While prostitution was a well-established part of Roman society, it was something that had to be hidden under the veil of respectability. Prostitutes could work, but they could not be seen to openly flaunt their role. They were allowed to serve, but only if they adhered to the specific role the state assigned to them. This control over prostitutes wasn't just about keeping them from being too visible. It was about maintaining Roman standards of morality and keeping social hierarchy intact. Let's also talk about the brothels. While Roman prostitutes had to follow strict guidelines on their dress and behavior, the brothels they worked in were equally controlled by laws. For instance, some brothels had to be situated in specific areas of the city, keeping them far from the respectable parts of town. The brothels weren't just places of work. They were like sanctioned zones where prostitution was allowed, but kept away from the Roman elite's daily lives. These locations were also heavily monitored by officials, ensuring that the business was kept in check. Authorities couldn't risk letting prostitution spill over into proper society. Beyond the brothels, Roman law also required that prostitutes register their profession, which meant they were kept on record. This surveillance of their existence kept them from becoming too rebellious or threatening to the social order. It was a strange sort of protection. You were allowed to work, but only if you adhered to all the rules. You were treated like property, either owned outright by a brothel keeper or a private individual, or you were a registered sex worker, kept under the watchful eyes of Roman authorities. In some ways, these laws were meant to protect the women who worked as prostitutes, but let's be real. Here, it wasn't about offering them freedom or autonomy. It was about controlling them, keeping them as part of the Roman social structure where everything had its place. Prostitutes had to comply with these rules, not out of respect for the law, but out of necessity. If you were caught breaking the dress code or flaunting your position too openly, you risked fines, punishment, or even public shaming. The strangest part of this system was that while prostitution itself was legal and a staple of Roman life, society still viewed it as something dirty, something to be kept in the shadows. Prostitutes were essential, but they were also second-class citizens, forced to navigate a legal system that saw them as both necessary and undesirable. They worked within a framework of oppression, always having to follow the rules, always under scrutiny, and always vulnerable to the whims of a government that didn't seem to know what to do with them. So while ancient Rome may have seemed like a land of indulgence and luxury for the wealthy elite, for its prostitutes, it was a life of legal constraints, social judgment, and limited autonomy. You were allowed to survive, but you were never truly free. The laws of ancient Rome didn't just regulate prostitution, they suffocated it, boxed it in, and kept it out of sight. Just when you thought the life of a Roman prostitute couldn't get worse, here comes the fun part: diseases. The Romans didn't have antibiotics, modern hygiene, or the ability to Google treatment for ancient STDs, so prostitutes faced significant health risks. Imagine not only working in the filth of the streets, but also dealing with a higher-than-average chance of catching something that would make your day a whole lot worse. In ancient Rome, disease was a constant companion, and for prostitutes, it was almost a given. The streets of Rome were crowded, dirty, and unsanitary. Public toilets, open sewers, and the smell of rotting food and waste permeated the air, and hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority. For the vast majority of Romans, personal cleanliness was a luxury rather than a norm, and for prostitutes, it was no different. On top of that, prostitution was a profession that involved intimate physical contact with multiple people every day. All those bodily fluids, they didn't stay neatly contained in a sterile environment. The risk of disease was high, very high. The most common of these diseases were sexually transmitted infections, STIs. Without antibiotics, treatments for these conditions were limited to herbal remedies or little more than wishful thinking. The idea of treating an infection wasn't about stopping the disease. It was about trying to soothe the symptoms as best as you could. Could you imagine being infected and having to wait for your body to either fight it off or make the problem worse? That was the grim reality for Roman prostitutes. STIs such as gonorrhea and syphilis were rampant, and with little to no way of treating them effectively, the consequences were dire. Many women suffered from recurring infections, and some likely faced infertility or death from untreated diseases. But it wasn't just the STIs that posed a threat. Prostitutes were also at risk of other infections from the environment they worked in. Remember, ancient Rome wasn't exactly known for its cleanliness. Public baths, while common, weren't always sanitary, and the constant exposure to filth, either from working on the streets or in a brothel, made it easy to pick up all sorts of infections, from skin diseases like scabies to respiratory illnesses like tuberculosis. Prostitutes were vulnerable to every kind of bug that roamed through the crowded, polluted city. As a prostitute, your health was almost secondary to your ability to perform your job. And let's talk about the toll it took on the body. With the constant physical strain, a prostitute's body wasn't just at risk from disease, it was worn out. Repeated sexual contact, combined with long hours on your feet or lying on hard surfaces, led to physical injuries and exhaustion. The repeated trauma could damage tissues, muscles, and bones, not to mention the emotional toll it took. If you contracted a disease, the physical strain combined with the emotional stress could leave you with very few options for recovery. But the dangers didn't stop at diseases and injuries. Prostitutes were also at high risk of abuse and violence. Without the legal protections that more respectable women enjoyed, prostitutes had to deal with all kinds of unwanted attention, and not just from customers. In a society that didn't care much for the rights of women, and especially women in prostitution, the threat of physical harm was ever present. It wasn't uncommon for a prostitute to be attacked or forced to perform acts against her will by customers or even her brothel owner. What's worse, the high rates of disease didn't just affect the prostitutes, they affected their clients as well. Roman men who visited brothels were just as likely to contract something from these women, and as with the women, there was little to no medical help available to treat them. The cycle of disease wasn't just a risk for one side of the transaction, it was part of the entire structure of prostitution in Rome. This mutual risk made it all the more troubling that diseases were not only widespread, but accepted as part of the job. In ancient Rome, the diseases were an invisible cost of doing business. Prostitutes couldn't afford to stop and take time off to heal, and even if they could, there were no proper means of recovery. The lack of hygiene, the constant exposure to disease, and the sheer volume of physical contact meant that prostitution was a job fraught with dangers. It wasn't just about attracting clients and maintaining a facade of beauty. It was about surviving the next day, not just physically, but also mentally. Living in constant fear of illness, suffering through the effects of an untreated infection, and dealing with the pain and isolation of a body used and abused. These were the hidden costs of working in Roman prostitution. So the next time you think of Roman brothels and imagine them as places of lavish indulgence and carefree pleasures, remember the health risks that came with the job. Diseases, injuries, and violence were constant companions for many prostitutes in ancient Rome, and these risks were an unfortunate part of their daily reality. It wasn't just the customers who paid a price, it was the women too. And when you're living in a world with no antibiotics, no modern sanitation, and no real health care, the price of survival was far higher than we can imagine. Bathing was a big deal in ancient Rome, so big, in fact, that it was one of the few activities that even the poorest of Romans could enjoy, as public baths were scattered all over the empire. But what about Roman prostitutes? Did they get the luxury of a good soak? Or were they relegated to the same communal baths where the air smelled like a combination of wet dog and cheap wine? Let's take a look. In ancient Rome, public baths were a crucial part of daily life. The bathhouses were everywhere, from the grand imperial baths to the smaller, more modest versions scattered throughout the city. These public bathhouses were a place for Romans to relax, socialize, and clean themselves. And for a culture that didn't have modern plumbing, they were a marvel. But while many Romans enjoyed the luxury of bathing as part of their daily routine, the experience for prostitutes was a bit different. Sure, the opportunity for a good bath was there, but the realities of the job often meant that personal cleanliness was a luxury, not a guarantee. Let's start with the idea of cleanliness in ancient Rome. For most Romans, cleanliness was a sign of status. The wealthy had their private baths, often inside their homes, where they could bathe in solitude and comfort. For the common folk, there were the public baths, no privacy, but plenty of room to scrub off the dirt of the day. Prostitutes, however, often had to make do with the same bathhouses that everyone else used, and let's be real, these weren't the spa-like experiences we think of today. Sure, there were hot and cold pools, but the communal nature of the baths meant that they were often overcrowded and less than sanitary. Imagine trying to get clean in a bathhouse where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, and incense. Picture yourself surrounded by other people, soldiers, workers, merchants, splashing around, some of them probably not very keen on personal hygiene themselves. And let's not forget about the grime and dirt that likely collected in the water. Bathing in such conditions wasn't exactly a soothing, rejuvenating experience. It was more of a necessity. If you were a prostitute, you weren't visiting the baths for relaxation or self-care. You were there to scrub off the day's work, hoping to feel a little less dirty before facing your next customer. But despite these conditions, cleanliness was still important, especially for prostitutes. In a profession where appearance was everything, staying as fresh and presentable as possible was key. Prostitutes in Roman brothels were expected to look clean, not just for their own well-being, but to meet the standards of their clients. There was an understanding that men didn't want to pay for the services of a woman who looked or smelled unpleasant. The pressure to maintain some semblance of cleanliness was constant, but given the state of Roman public baths, it must have felt like a constant battle, while a good soak in the warm water might have helped remove some of the day's sweat and grime. The reality was that you were probably never truly clean in a way we'd consider today. Of course, the wealthy courtesans who worked in the more exclusive brothels had access to better facilities, and their baths were undoubtedly more private and luxurious. These women had the means to keep up appearances in ways that the street prostitutes simply couldn't afford. They would likely have bathed in clean, fragrant water and used oils and perfumes to keep their bodies smelling pleasant. They might even have had attendants to help with their grooming and cleaning, ensuring they maintained an air of exclusivity and allure. But for the majority of prostitutes, personal hygiene was an ongoing struggle, a constant reminder of their status in society. Beyond the bathhouses, the tools available for personal cleanliness were limited. There were no fancy soap bars or bottled shampoos. Prostitutes likely used basic oils or a mixture of water and ash to scrub themselves. To freshen up between baths, they might have relied on perfumes made from herbs, flowers, and spices, which were often overpowering in an attempt to cover up the less than pleasant smells of the streets and brothels. But these perfumes weren't just for smell, they were a way to create an illusion of cleanliness. The scent was meant to make clients forget that the air in the brothel might have been heavy with the stench of sweat, body odor, and old food. It was a layer of social camouflage that helped prostitutes pretend they weren't as dirty as the environment around them. So while the Roman bathing culture was an essential part of society, it was a double-edged sword for prostitutes. They had access to baths, yes, but the conditions weren't ideal, and hygiene wasn't exactly a luxury. The expectation of cleanliness was present, but for most prostitutes, the resources to maintain that cleanliness were limited. Bathing, as much as it was a part of Roman culture, wasn't about comfort or relaxation for these women. It was about survival. It was a tool in their arsenal to remain presentable, to keep up appearances, and to try to maintain some semblance of dignity in a profession that often robbed them of it. Cleanliness in ancient Rome was more about the performance of being clean than actually being able to enjoy the luxury of a real, fresh start at the end of the day. Roman clients ranged from wealthy senators to everyday soldiers. But how did these men treat their service providers? Was it all about a little fun, or was there a darker side to these interactions? If you were a prostitute in ancient Rome, you had to be ready for anything, from unexpected demands to rude customers who didn't know how to take no for an answer. When you think of a client in ancient Rome, you might imagine a wealthy man, draped in fine tunics, strolling into a luxurious brothel for a moment of pleasure. And sure, there were plenty of well-off men who treated prostitutes with respect, seeing them as entertainment, perhaps even as a status symbol. But the reality for Roman prostitutes was far more complicated, and the clients they served were often a mix of the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. You didn't just serve the rich and noble, you served everyone, from high-ranking officials to men whose only wealth was a coin or two they'd saved from a day of hard labor. At the upper end of the spectrum, wealthy Roman senators, generals, and aristocrats were the kinds of men who could afford the best courtesans in the most luxurious brothels. These men often came for pleasure and entertainment rather than necessity, and their interactions with prostitutes were generally transactional, more about status than desire. If you were a courtesan catering to this crowd, you were expected to maintain a level of decorum and allure. You were part of their social scene, and your job was to be as much an object of beauty and fascination as a provider of physical pleasure. For these men, the experience wasn't about intimacy. It was about maintaining an image. You were treated with a certain level of respect, but ultimately, you were still a means to an end, a beautiful, temporary escape from their often rigid, formal lives. But that's where the pleasant part of being a Roman prostitute ended. The majority of clients were far less respectful. The everyday Roman soldier, merchant, or laborer wasn't visiting brothels out of a sense of luxury. They were seeking an outlet for their desires and frustrations. These men could be quick to anger, impulsive, and sometimes even violent. Prostitutes, especially those working in lower-end brothels, had to deal with clients who saw them as little more than objects to be used. The idea of consent, not always a part of the equation. For many prostitutes, particularly slaves, the line between serving a client and being coerced or forced was a blur. For some men, the power they held over women in prostitution gave them a sense of entitlement that was difficult to challenge. Then, of course, there were the really ugly clients. These were the men who came in with no regard for your comfort, your dignity, or your well-being. They could be abusive, manipulative, and sometimes downright cruel. A prostitute had to stay on her toes, constantly assessing which clients would be easy to deal with and which would be a headache or worse. These were the men who made you feel small, insignificant, and utterly disposable. The kind of men who didn't just pay for a service. They took advantage of the power dynamic between you and them, pushing boundaries, making demands that crossed the line from normal to abusive. For the women in ancient Roman brothels, it wasn't always a matter of whether they liked their clients. It was a matter of survival. If a client was rude, overly demanding, or outright hostile, a prostitute couldn't just tell him to leave. She had to tolerate whatever behavior came her way, whether that meant submitting to uncomfortable acts, facing violence, or simply being made to feel unworthy. The power imbalance between the clients and the prostitutes was significant, and unfortunately, there weren't many ways for a woman in this profession to assert herself or refuse a man without facing serious consequences. In a world where a prostitute's Value was determined by her looks and her ability to please. Emotional connections weren't even part of the equation. The most frequent encounters were devoid of any intimacy or personal exchange. These were quick, often mechanical transactions meant to fulfill physical desires with no care for emotional satisfaction or mutual respect. Even in the higher-end brothels, where the elite had more control over the experience, the role of a prostitute was largely dehumanizing. While they might have been treated more kindly than their street counterparts, they were still a form of entertainment for the wealthy, bought and sold for their beauty and sexual appeal. However, it wasn't all bleak. Some men, particularly in higher-class brothels, did treat prostitutes with a level of politeness and respect, though that respect was often shallow, based on the fact that prostitutes were part of the social scene rather than personal connections. In these cases, the interaction might feel more like a performance, where both parties understood the rules of the game. But even then, you could never forget the underlying power dynamic that kept the prostitutes in their place. They were still seen as a commodity, something to be used and discarded. So what did it take to navigate the vast and unpredictable sea of Roman clients? Resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to endure. You had to stay alert, read people quickly, and know when to stand your ground and when to accept a client's whims. It wasn't just about physical survival. It was about maintaining some semblance of control over your circumstances while working in a profession that was bound by the demands of those who held the power, the men who paid for your time. And in a world where the good, the bad, and the ugly were all part of the same reality, surviving as a prostitute in ancient Rome wasn't just about surviving the job. It was about surviving the men who made that job so unpredictable. Did Roman prostitutes have time for romance? Was there a chance for true love? Or were their hearts just as empty as their coin purses after a hard day of work? It turns out, love in ancient Rome wasn't as simple as the movies make it out to be. For most of these women, their love life was an afterthought, buried under layers of Roman expectations and a lack of options. In a society that placed a premium on status, family, and social class, the idea of romantic love was reserved for those who had the luxury of time, freedom, and personal choice. Unfortunately, prostitutes, especially those working in lower-class brothels or as slaves, didn't have the luxury of romantic freedom. Their relationships, whether with clients, colleagues, or anyone else, were driven more by survival than by affection. Love, in its most idealized form, wasn't something that would have been part of their daily lives. For many Roman prostitutes, relationships with clients were strictly transactional. Their job was to fulfill the desires of the men who paid for their time, not to form deep emotional connections. These were quick, fleeting encounters with little to no emotional investment. There was no room for love in the transactional nature of these interactions. After all, if you're spending hours each day being used as an object of physical pleasure, where do you find the space for romantic feelings? Can you fall in love when the very nature of your work demands that you remain emotionally detached? And what about the prostitutes who were slaves? For these women, the situation was even more complicated. Slaves had no control over their lives, let alone their romantic choices. They were bought, sold, and forced into sexual servitude with no freedom to choose partners or relationships. The concept of love wasn't even on their radar. If they were lucky, they might find a fellow slave to share their misery with, but even that was a rare exception. They were bound by the harsh realities of their circumstances, and their bodies, by extension, were not their own. How could they dream of love when they were seen as mere property to be used and discarded? For those prostitutes who were free and had more autonomy, there might have been a slight chance for a different kind of connection, but it was still incredibly limited. The very nature of their work placed them outside the traditional Roman norms of marriage and family. In a society where a woman's worth was often defined by her relationship to her family or husband, prostitutes had little chance of finding a love that was socially accepted. It wasn't just that romantic relationships were hard to form. The Roman social structure made it almost impossible for prostitutes to have a normal, fulfilling romantic life. If you were a prostitute, your relationships were likely to be viewed with suspicion and disdain, whether they were with clients or with men who sought you out for companionship. Even when a prostitute might have wanted to form a bond with someone, the stigma of their profession stood in the way. Roman society had little respect for sex workers, and being a prostitute, whether by choice or by circumstance, often meant being labeled as immoral, unworthy, and even dangerous. This stigma didn't just affect the way others viewed prostitutes, it affected the way they saw themselves. If your worth was based on your body and your ability to perform sexual acts for money, where did love fit into the equation? How could you believe you were capable of being loved when the world saw you as nothing more than a vessel for other people's pleasure? Moreover, prostitution was a profession that demanded physical and emotional exhaustion. After a day of dealing with clients, both the good and the bad, how much energy was left to nurture a relationship? Romance requires time, emotional presence, and care, luxuries that were often unavailable to Roman prostitutes. When the day ended, after hours of enduring uncomfortable or sometimes abusive interactions with clients, many prostitutes likely just wanted to rest, eat, and prepare for the next round. The idea of going home to someone you loved or having a deep, meaningful conversation with a partner was likely far removed from the reality of their day-to-day lives. Occasionally, a prostitute might have been lucky enough to find a client who cared for her beyond the physical transaction. There are stories from Roman history about women who found love with wealthy patrons, or even managed to escape their situation and live a life of relative comfort. But these instances were rare. Most prostitutes, whether free or enslaved, had to deal with the harsh reality that their relationships were centered around survival, not love. The closest thing they had to a partner was often another prostitute or perhaps a fellow slave, both of whom were just as trapped as they were in their circumstances. So was there room for love in the life of a Roman prostitute? The short answer is no. For most, love was a distant dream, buried beneath the layers of survival, societal stigma, and the physical and emotional toll of their work. While some might have had fleeting connections with clients or found comfort in temporary companionship, the harsh reality was that romantic love simply didn't fit into the brutal, dehumanizing world of prostitution in ancient Rome. For these women, love was more of a luxury than a possibility, something they could dream about, but not truly experience in their lifetime. In a time when fashion was used to indicate social class, how did Roman prostitutes dress? Well, you might be surprised to find out that they had to look good, really good. From elaborate hairstyles to attention-grabbing outfits, a prostitute's job was as much about style as it was about service. And no, they didn't have the luxury of an Instagram post to show off their new look. In ancient Rome, appearance was everything. The wealthy flaunted their social status with clothes made of expensive fabrics like silk and accessories like gold jewelry and intricate sandals. For the lower classes, however, fashion was a tool of survival, and this included prostitutes who had to craft an image that balanced between attracting customers and fitting into Roman society's rigid standards. But this wasn't just about being pretty, it was about using your appearance to make a living in a world where beauty and status often dictated your worth. The key to a prostitute's attire wasn't just to look attractive, it was to stand out and signal to potential clients that you were available, desirable, and at least a little luxurious. Prostitutes who worked in higher-end brothels or catered to wealthy men might have had access to better clothing and jewelry, but they still had to adhere to the rules of their profession. Too much luxury in their appearance might make them look like a woman of high status, which would be a disqualifier for many men seeking quick, inexpensive pleasures. Prostitutes had to dress in a way that would attract attention, but also keep them within the accepted social boundaries of their profession. So what did Roman prostitutes wear? First off, there was the tunic, a simple garment worn by nearly all Romans, but for prostitutes, it could be styled in various ways to show off their assets without crossing the line into excess. The tunic was typically made of wool, but prostitutes might wear ones that were dyed bright colors, like red, which signified passion and attention. Brightly colored fabrics were used to attract the eye, and the color red, in particular, had connotations of desire and lust. It wasn't a subtle look, and it was meant to stand out. But the tunic wasn't the only part of the outfit. Roman prostitutes, especially those in wealthier brothels, would often adorn themselves with accessories like jewelry, necklaces, earrings, and bracelets. These were important status symbols, even for women who had no other wealth to their name. Jewelry, while not as extravagant as what a noblewoman might wear, was a tool for signaling that you were worth paying attention to. Gold and silver pieces were common, and they weren't just worn for decoration. They were a way to show the world that you were valuable, even if your true worth was measured by your ability to entertain men. Footwear, too, was a key component of a prostitute's look. Roman women were often seen wearing sandals, but prostitutes might wear a more elaborate version with decorative straps or leather pieces. These shoes weren't just for walking, they were part of the overall performance. The shoes had to be functional, of course, but they were also part of the broader image of sex appeal. An eye-catching pair of sandals could draw attention to a woman's legs, emphasizing the assets she was meant to sell. In a way, the footwear was another layer of the message that a prostitute's body was for sale. Now let's talk about hair, because in Rome, no woman's outfit was complete without the perfect hairstyle. Prostitutes, like the women of the elite class, would spend significant time on their hair. In fact, the more intricate the hairstyle, the more likely it was that a woman was trying to signal her availability to high-paying clients. Elaborate curls, twists, and braids were common, and sometimes these hairstyles were accessorized with beads or ribbons. Just as Roman men and women of high status wore elaborate hairstyles to indicate their wealth and social standing, prostitutes would use their hair to add another level of visual appeal to their image. The time spent on their hair was an investment. An investment meant to catch the eye and spark desire. For some prostitutes, makeup played a role in their overall appearance as well. Roman women, in general, used cosmetics made from natural ingredients like lead and chalk to create pale faces and bold, dramatic eye makeup. Prostitutes, who needed to look their best, were no different. The use of makeup wasn't just about enhancing beauty, it was about projecting an image of health, vibrancy, and desirability. The pale, flawless look made a prostitute appear untouched, pristine, and desirable, a paradox in a profession where their very job required them to engage in physical intimacy. Yet despite the focus on outward appearance, it's important to remember that prostitutes had little control over the clothes and accessories they wore. For the enslaved women in particular, their attire and appearance were dictated by their masters or brothel owners. While some brothels allowed prostitutes to wear more stylish clothes, the majority of women were forced to wear whatever was provided, often scraps or second-hand garments. For these women, fashion wasn't a luxury, it was a tool for survival. A well-chosen outfit could increase their earnings for the day, while a poorly chosen one could mean the difference between a client or an empty room. So while Roman prostitutes didn't have Instagram posts to showcase their outfits, their clothes were still a vital part of their business. In a world where status was everything, their appearance wasn't just about looking attractive, it was about signaling their availability and value. Every tunic, every piece of jewelry, every twist of their hair was a carefully constructed message meant to attract attention and ensure they could continue doing their job. In a society that prided itself on appearances, the prostitutes of ancient Rome had to use fashion as a tool to survive in a world that treated them as little more than objects. Being a prostitute in ancient Rome wasn't just about making money, it was about surviving within a complex cultural system. How did Roman norms affect women in this line of work? Were there any moments where a prostitute could escape the grind, or were they forever trapped by the Roman way of life? This segment takes a deeper look at the social pressures that shaped their day-to-day lives. In ancient Rome, prostitution wasn't just a profession, it was a social institution. While some forms of sex work were tolerated, they were still bound by strict cultural and moral expectations. Prostitutes were generally viewed as necessary for the functioning of society, but they were also seen as inferior and morally corrupt. This perception was deeply rooted in Roman cultural norms, which placed a heavy emphasis on family, marriage, and honor. Prostitution, by contrast, represented a breakdown of these ideals, so those who engaged in the profession were viewed with a mix of tolerance, disdain, and disdainful curiosity. The first way Roman cultural norms impacted prostitutes was in terms of how they were classified and treated. There were two broad categories for women in sex work: the Meretrices, free prostitutes, and the Scorta, slaves or forced prostitutes. Both groups had little to no control over their lives, but the level of control exerted over them differed significantly. Free prostitutes, or Meretrices, while technically allowed to make their own choices, often had few other career options. Given the social structure of Rome, where women had limited independence, prostitution was one of the only avenues available for women of lower classes to survive. However, they were still bound by the constraints of Roman moral standards. Free prostitutes were viewed as disreputable, and their work was seen as degrading to their personal and family honor. They could never rise above their station. They were forever marked by the stigma attached to their profession. On the other hand, Scorta, the enslaved women, had even less freedom. These women were often trapped in brothels, forced to work without any hope of escape. They were legally considered property and had no rights to their own bodies or earnings. Enslaved prostitutes had their fates dictated by their masters, who profited off their labor. The cultural perception of enslaved prostitutes was even more degrading. They were often seen as the lowest of the low, their worth reduced entirely to their sexual value. The Roman idea of honor, which was so central to its social fabric, excluded these women entirely. They had no family name, no heritage to speak of, and were subject to the whims of their owners, often viewed as little more than disposable commodities. But there were still moments of nuance. Some women in the profession did manage to escape the worst of these social pressures, particularly those in the higher echelons of prostitution. High-status courtesans or meretrices who entertained powerful men might have more freedom than their lower-class counterparts. These women often had the luxury of living in relative comfort, owning property, and sometimes even having the chance to escape the brothel life through their relationships with rich patrons. They might have been able to carve out a space for themselves in Roman society, though this was still always tainted by their status as prostitutes. Despite these exceptions, however, most Roman prostitutes lived under immense pressure to maintain their appearance, their sexual allure, and their ability to please. Roman society placed a high value on aesthetics. Beauty, youth, and charm were prized, and for prostitutes, this pressure was constant. Prostitutes had to be skilled in keeping themselves attractive, and this often meant sacrificing their physical and emotional well-being. The Roman obsession with physical beauty and performance meant that many women in this profession were forced to maintain an outward appearance of health and vitality, despite the toll their work took on them. Perhaps the most significant cultural pressure faced by prostitutes was the unrelenting need to conform to the expectations placed on their behavior. Prostitutes in ancient Rome were expected to be available at all times. Whether they were working in brothels, on street corners, or in the homes of private clients, they had to remain ready and willing. This requirement was not only physical, but emotional. Many women had to suppress their own feelings, desires, and sense of autonomy to serve the needs of others. The concept of pleasure was shaped by the desires of their male clients, and prostitutes had little say in the matter. The very act of being a prostitute was seen as a rejection of traditional Roman values like chastity and marriage, and that cultural disconnect meant that prostitutes were always positioned as outsiders, no matter their status. For many Roman prostitutes, the profession wasn't just about making a living. It was about living in a society that had strict and unforgiving rules. Roman culture, with its rigid class structures and moral codes, forced prostitutes to navigate an impossible terrain, surviving in a world that both needed them and despised them. They were part of the fabric of Roman society, but they were never allowed to truly belong to it. Could they ever escape this grind? For some, the answer was no. For others, there were occasional glimpses of freedom, but these were fleeting, dependent on circumstance. The societal expectations and the personal toll of prostitution kept most women stuck in a cycle that would have been nearly impossible to break. Ultimately, the pressures of Roman society, the need to conform to beauty standards, the unrelenting demands of clients, and the cultural stigma meant that most prostitutes were caught in a life where escape was a rare luxury, not a reality. In ancient Rome, gods were everywhere, literally on every corner, in every market, and even in the most unexpected places. But how did religion affect the lives of prostitutes? Were they seen as cursed by the gods, or did the gods offer any protection? This segment will explore the intersection of ancient Roman religion and the life of a prostitute. Religion in ancient Rome was intricately woven into the fabric of everyday life. From the grand temples of Jupiter to the household shrines dedicated to Lares and Penates, the gods were an omnipresent force in Roman society. For the average Roman, worshipping the gods was an essential part of daily existence. Rituals, sacrifices, and prayers were all aimed at pleasing the gods and securing their favor. But what about those who lived on the fringes of Roman society, like prostitutes? Did the gods take an interest in their lives, or were they left to suffer without divine intervention? In Roman society, prostitution was seen as a necessary, evil, and accepted part of life, yet still socially inferior. Prostitutes were typically viewed as morally corrupt, existing outside the boundaries of respectability. In a world that placed so much importance on family and social honor, prostitutes were an uncomfortable contradiction to the ideal Roman way of life. They were, in essence, both needed and shunned. So how did the gods view them? Interestingly, Roman religion didn't necessarily condemn prostitutes outright. In fact, some deities were closely associated with sexuality, fertility, and love, providing a paradoxical connection between the divine and the profane. Take, for example, the goddess Venus, the Roman counterpart to Aphrodite in Greek mythology. Venus was the goddess of love, beauty, and sexuality, and she was widely worshipped by both men and women. Her temples were places of prayer and worship for those seeking love or lust, and many prostitutes likely invoked her name, hoping for divine favor or protection in their line of work. While Venus represented romantic and physical love, her followers, especially prostitutes, might have prayed to her for the ability to attract clients or keep them coming back. However, while Venus was a goddess of love, she wasn't the only deity associated with sexuality in Roman religion. Another significant figure was Priapus, the god of fertility, often depicted with an oversized phallus. Priapus was revered in gardens, brothels, and markets, and his statues were frequently placed at entrances to ensure good fortune. Prostitutes and brothel owners may have seen Priapus as a symbol of both fertility and financial success, hoping for protection and prosperity. In fact, many brothels in Rome would place small statues of Priapus in their establishment, invoking his blessings in the hope of attracting more customers and ensuring the continued success of their business. Yet despite these connections to deities of love and fertility, prostitutes in ancient Rome were often caught in a complex relationship with religion. While they may have prayed to Venus or offered sacrifices to Priapus, they were also viewed through a lens of moral impurity. Roman society held deep reservations about women who engaged in sex work, and this cultural stigma extended to the religious realm as well. Prostitutes were frequently excluded from certain religious ceremonies and festivals, particularly those that emphasized purity or family values, like the Vestal Virgin's rites. The concept of purity was central to Roman religion, and sex work was seen as incompatible with the ideals of chastity and virtue. On the other hand, the very presence of temples dedicated to gods of fertility and love suggests that Roman religion didn't fully exclude prostitutes from divine favor. The gods, after all, were not just patrons of the elite. They were part of every facet of Roman life. Prostitutes could still seek refuge in the gods' temples, and even if their work was seen as sinful or immoral, their prayers and offerings weren't necessarily rejected. The gods were not bound by human notions of morality. They were interested in the material and practical needs of their followers. Interestingly, some Roman prostitutes were also associated with the sacred or the divine in ways that blurred the lines between the profane and the sacred. Vestal virgins, the priestesses of Vesta, were celebrated for their chastity and role in maintaining the sacred fire of Rome. However, in contrast, there were also sacred prostitutes who worked in temples as part of religious rituals. These women, known as sacerdotes or sacerdotales, were involved in sacred rites and offerings tied to fertility or agricultural cycles. Their work might have been seen as both spiritual and sexual, representing a complex relationship between sex, the sacred, and divine favor. These women, unlike the typical prostitute, were revered and held in higher esteem, though their role still carried its own contradictions. As for everyday prostitutes, the intersection of religion and work was likely a matter of survival. A prostitute would seek out divine protection from the gods, not just for spiritual reasons, but as a practical necessity. Prayers to Venus, offerings to Priapus, and small personal shrines might have been part of a prostitute's daily routine, hoping for the favor of the gods to help her navigate the dangers of her profession. Whether that meant avoiding disease, gaining more clients, or securing her safety in a volatile and often violent society. Religion, in the context of prostitution, didn't offer a way out. It didn't provide a clean path to freedom or escape from the profession. Instead, it was a coping mechanism, a way to gain small comforts in a world that saw prostitutes as necessary but unworthy. The gods might not have cared about the morality of the work, but they were called upon to ensure its continuation, to help those who had no other recourse but to turn to them for support. In the end, the gods in ancient Rome weren't concerned with the idea of sin in the way we might think today. For Roman prostitutes, the relationship with the divine was a complex mixture of hope, superstition, and practicality, a way to gain protection, success, and sometimes a brief reprieve from the harshness of their lives. Being a slave was tough, but being a slave prostitute in ancient Rome, that was an entirely different kind of hell. In this segment, we'll discuss the brutal reality of being a slave in the sex trade, where you had absolutely no choice in the matter and lived only to serve others. You didn't even have the luxury of basic human rights. Roman slavery was harsh, but for a prostitute, it was a life of compounded misery. As a slave, your body wasn't your own. It was an asset owned by someone else, your master, who could use it for whatever purpose they saw fit, including selling you to a brothel or forcing you to work in private homes. If you were a slave prostitute, you were seen as little more than a tool for pleasure, an object to be bought, used, and discarded. Your personal autonomy, your very humanity, was stripped away. You had no choice in the matter. You didn't even have the right to refuse a customer or to decide who used your body. The life of a slave prostitute was defined by powerlessness. You were not seen as a person with rights, desires, or needs, but as a commodity to be rented out. Roman law didn't recognize slaves as individuals, so there were no protections for a slave prostitute beyond what their masters might grant. You weren't just selling your body. You were living in a constant state of ownership and surveillance, constantly monitored and controlled. You had no freedom to leave, no say in your own fate. Every part of your life was dictated by your master's desires. The very concept of choice was foreign to you. While free prostitutes could at least make their own decisions, such as where they worked or with whom they engaged, slaves had none of that luxury. Slave prostitutes worked for whoever their masters told them to, whether it was in a brothel, a private home, or out on the streets. They could be ordered to sleep with anyone. There was no room for refusal. If a customer was particularly violent or abusive, the slave prostitute had little recourse. If they tried to resist or rebel, they could be punished, whipped, or even sold to another master. It was a brutal existence that offered little hope of escape or reprieve. Being forced into sexual servitude wasn't just physically degrading, it was also emotionally devastating. Slaves had no legal rights, and the emotional toll of being treated as a thing rather than a person was profound. There was no concept of love or affection in these relationships, no chance for intimacy. Your body was a tool for survival, and that tool was used at the whim of anyone willing to pay for it. Your personal worth was measured solely by your ability to perform, to provide pleasure, and to make money for your master. And if you didn't meet those expectations, you could be punished, discarded, or replaced. The physical toll on a slave prostitute was enormous. The human body wasn't built to withstand the constant physical strain that came with being sexually used by multiple men day in and day out. For a woman in this position, there was no time to rest or recover. You had no control over your own health. If you got sick, there was no time to seek medical help, and no one cared enough to provide it. Roman medicine, while advanced in some areas, wasn't equipped to deal with the kind of physical strain that came from constant sexual exploitation. STIs were rampant, and treatment was limited. Prostitutes, especially those who were slaves, were at high risk for infections, and many likely suffered from repeated illness, pain, and exhaustion. Even if a slave prostitute managed to survive physically, the psychological damage was just as severe. The trauma of being used and discarded by countless men, the lack of any real emotional connection, and the constant feeling of being unworthy or invisible could lead to lasting mental and emotional scars. Many slave prostitutes were likely too broken to dream of anything better. Their entire lives were defined by survival, with little hope of ever escaping their fate. But even amidst the horror of this existence, there were very few ways to escape. Slaves could sometimes buy their freedom, but this was rare. The cost of freedom was often prohibitively high, and for a prostitute, saving enough money to afford it was nearly impossible. If you were a slave prostitute, you were trapped in a vicious cycle. You worked to survive, but you never had the chance to improve your circumstances. Your body was constantly in demand, and your soul was continually crushed under the weight of a society that saw you as nothing more than a commodity. What's worse, because Roman society was built on a foundation of strict social hierarchies, there was little sympathy for those at the bottom. Prostitutes, especially slaves, were viewed as inherently immoral and dishonorable. This social stigma meant that even if a slave prostitute wanted to escape their life, there was no support system for them. The few who did manage to gain their freedom were often still ostracized, unable to return to a normal life because of their reputation. So being a slave prostitute in ancient Rome was an existence marked by dehumanization, exploitation, and constant abuse. You had no control over your own life, no autonomy, and no hope for a future outside of the chains that bound you to your master. Your work was a brutal, never-ending cycle, and the few moments of respite or relief were rare. In a world that valued power, status, and morality above all else, slaves, especially those in prostitution, were seen as the lowest of the low, trapped in a system that offered them nothing but suffering. Even the Romans knew the importance of cleanliness, but in a world without modern plumbing, how did prostitutes keep themselves clean? Spoiler, it wasn't pretty. In this segment, we'll take a look at the limited hygiene options available, the difficulties of staying clean in a city like Rome, and how our ancient counterparts dealt with personal care. In ancient Rome, personal hygiene was taken seriously, at least for the wealthy. The elites had access to private baths, perfumed oils, and luxurious grooming practices that helped maintain their social image. However, for the majority of the population, especially for prostitutes, hygiene was a constant challenge. The city's public baths, while popular, were far from the serene, pristine spa experiences we might imagine today. These communal spaces, where Romans went to bathe, socialize, and relax, were often overcrowded, unhygienic, and rife with disease. The water, shared by hundreds of people, was far from the clean filtered waters we have today. The lack of proper sanitation meant that any notion of cleanliness was merely superficial for most Romans, and for prostitutes, it was even more difficult to maintain the illusion of cleanliness when the reality of the conditions they worked in was so grim. Public baths were designed to accommodate the masses, but they didn't offer the kind of personal care that we would consider essential today. The water was not changed regularly, and with limited drainage, became contaminated. While there were usually large pools for hot and cold water, the bathhouses also had communal spaces where people would scrub themselves with oils and abrasive tools. Prostitutes, in particular, had to make the best of these facilities. But when you're working in an environment where the water was shared by so many others, cleanliness could hardly be maintained. The constant influx of people meant that any hopes for a truly refreshing, hygienic experience were dashed by the poor conditions of these public spaces. So how did prostitutes in ancient Rome keep themselves clean in a world where hygiene was far from a priority? For the most part, it was a daily struggle. While wealthy women could afford the luxury of regular visits to the public baths or even private baths, prostitutes didn't have the same access or resources. For many, keeping clean was a matter of convenience rather than personal care. They often relied on a mix of homemade cleansers, oils, salt, and various herbs used to scrub the skin and mask unpleasant odors. These oils were often scented, which helped cover the stench of the streets, body odor, and sometimes even the unpleasant smells of the brothels. But these cleaning rituals were not enough to keep prostitutes truly clean, and their exposure to dirt, disease, and harsh working conditions put their health at constant risk. With the lack of modern hygiene practices, infections and illnesses were rampant among prostitutes in ancient Rome. These women worked long hours, often without adequate rest, and exposure to disease was part of the job. The brothels, much like the public baths, were often breeding grounds for sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, and with no antibiotics or proper medical care, many prostitutes likely suffered from untreated infections that were passed from client to client. The idea of cleanliness wasn't just about appearance, it was about survival. If a prostitute was unlucky enough to contract an infection, there was little that could be done to treat it, and the risk of spreading it to others was ever present. Beyond the brothels and public baths, there was little available to help with hygiene. Prostitutes didn't have the luxury of private spaces where they could keep themselves clean and rest between clients. Most of the time, they had to work in filthy conditions, often sharing cramped quarters with other women in similar positions. Personal care tools, such as combs or cloths, were sparse, and the absence of effective medical treatment meant that many prostitutes didn't have the option of treating skin conditions, infections, or illnesses. For many, the struggle for cleanliness went beyond vanity. It was about health, survival, and the sheer effort of trying to maintain a semblance of dignity in a world that didn't allow for it. The difficulty of maintaining personal hygiene was compounded by the nature of the work itself. Prostitutes spent hours on their feet, walking through the dirty streets of Rome, dealing with the grime of the market, the stench of animal waste, and the filth of the crowded city. When they were working in brothels, the air was thick with the smells of sweat, stale perfumes, and food, further complicating any efforts at cleanliness. After hours of physical labor, maintaining a fresh appearance was nearly impossible. Even the wealthy patrons who visited the high-end brothels weren't spared from the reality of filth and disease. The constant pressure to look fresh while working in an environment so full of risks was a psychological strain on these women. So what did cleanliness mean to a prostitute in ancient Rome? It wasn't about the comfort or luxury we associate with the concept of being clean today. Instead, it was a daily struggle, a battle against the environment, the physical demands of the profession, and the constant threat of disease. It was about finding ways to stay presentable enough for the next client, using whatever tools were available to mask the harsh realities of the job. Hygiene, for Roman prostitutes, wasn't a luxury. It was an act of survival, a coping mechanism in a society that offered little in terms of personal care or compassion. Cleanliness was more about appearance than actual health, and the struggle to maintain any form of it was just another aspect of the relentless grind they faced each day. Being a prostitute in a Roman brothel wasn't always about customers being kind and respectful. Wealthy Roman men had all the power, and that power often came with little regard for the women providing services. This tension created a complicated and often hostile work environment that, unsurprisingly, wasn't fun. In ancient Rome, brothels were not just places where men went for pleasure. They were also reflections of the immense power disparities that defined Roman society. While many patrons were simply looking for a brief moment of escapism, others treated their encounters with brothel workers as a way to assert dominance over those with less power. For a woman in the sex trade, particularly one in a brothel, her job came with the constant struggle to maintain some semblance of control over her own body and dignity. Unfortunately, these were often stripped away by the very men who paid for her services. The wealthy men who frequented brothels, particularly the high-end establishments, were accustomed to having their desires catered to with minimal resistance. They had the money, the status, and the social power that allowed them to act with little concern for the emotional or physical well-being of the women they hired. This power dynamic often led to situations where the women were treated more like objects than human beings. In some cases, these men may have expected to be obeyed without question, taking pleasure not only in the physical services offered, but also in exerting their dominance. For a prostitute in such an environment, maintaining any sense of autonomy was nearly impossible. The tension between wealthy clients and brothel workers wasn't just limited to the sexual transaction itself. it also spilled over into the everyday interactions between the men and women. A brothel worker wasn't just a service provider. She was expected to play a specific role, to embody a certain image, and to meet the often unrealistic expectations set by both the brothel owner and the client. The wealthier men were often used to getting exactly what they wanted, which could include bizarre or degrading requests. And while a prostitute was there to fulfill the needs of her clients, she wasn't a robot. She had her own limits, her own sense of dignity. But in a profession where your livelihood depended on pleasing others, those limits were often pushed to their breaking point. Many wealthy clients in Roman brothels may have seen themselves as doing a favor to the prostitutes they hired, believing that their patronage was a form of benevolence. After all, they were paying for a service, and as far as they were concerned, that meant they were entitled to whatever they wanted. This sense of entitlement often translated into demanding behavior. Prostitutes had to endure not just physical demands, but emotional ones as well, being expected to put on a facade of enthusiasm, cheerfulness, and submission, regardless of how they felt. The act of maintaining a pleasant demeanor, even when dealing with rude or abusive clients, was essential to their survival in the business. If a prostitute didn't comply with the client's demands, even if those demands were unreasonable or harmful, she risked losing her job, or worse. At times, the wealthy clients treated the women as if they were no more than disposable objects, to be used and discarded once they had their fill. In these environments, brothel workers had little power to negotiate their treatment. Their role was not just to provide physical pleasure, but to perform an emotional labor that often required them to suppress any personal emotions. They were forced to remain emotionally detached from their clients, even as the clients imposed their will upon them. This emotional labor took a toll, creating a work environment that was not only physically draining, but also psychologically damaging. For many women, the emotional burden of their profession far outweighed the physical demands. While brothel workers did have the opportunity to earn money from their work, the emotional and physical costs were steep. The tension between the wealth and power of the clients and the vulnerability of the women who served them created an atmosphere of hostility. This wasn't a job that left much room for respect or kindness, at least not from the client's side. The women were often treated as commodities, to be used for their pleasure, and once the transaction was over, they were discarded, ready for the next man to take their place. In many ways, this lack of respect and the transactional nature of their work contributed to the larger power imbalance in Roman society, where women, especially prostitutes, were at the mercy of the men who controlled the economic and social order. This tense relationship between wealthy clients and brothel workers had repercussions beyond just the sexual encounters themselves. It created an environment where the women had to constantly manage their emotions, try to meet impossible expectations, and endure humiliation, all while maintaining the appearance of being happy and willing. The emotional toll of being constantly subjugated, of always having to please without the chance to assert yourself or demand respect, was an exhausting and often soul-crushing experience. In this world, personal agency was a luxury. Prostitutes had to navigate the complex web of power, domination, and submission every single day. Their work, dictated by the whims of their clients, left little room for personal satisfaction or fulfillment. The emotional, physical, and psychological costs of this work were heavy, but the alternative, being ostracized from Roman society, was even worse. For the women in ancient Roman brothels, The price of survival was high, and the tensions they faced with their wealthy clients were just a part of the harsh reality of their profession. In Roman times, brothels were often seen as necessary evils. They were part of the infrastructure of Roman society, and some historians even argue that the empire's prosperity was at least partly due to the steady income from brothels. But were they all that good, or were they just a necessary means of controlling men's urges? Brothels in ancient Rome were a paradox. On one hand, they were a well-established part of the empire's social structure, widely accepted and financially supported by both the government and the people. On the other hand, they existed at the margins of Roman society, viewed with both tolerance and disdain. These institutions were a place where the sexual appetites of men, from the lowest laborers to the highest senators, could be indulged without the complications of romantic attachment or family obligations. But despite their ubiquity, brothels were never seen as glamorous or dignified spaces. For the prostitutes who worked in them, life was a daily grind, and for the men who visited, the experience was often transactional and devoid of intimacy. Sex work in ancient Rome was largely a product of the empire's rigid social hierarchy. Roman society placed immense value on status, virtue, and family honor, and the very act of selling sex was considered to be in direct opposition to these ideals. And yet, the need to regulate and control men's sexual desires became an undeniable reality. Roman men, particularly those of the elite classes, often had multiple outlets for their physical needs. Some had wives, others kept mistresses, and still others frequented brothels. In a society where sex outside of marriage was generally frowned upon, but virtually unavoidable, brothels provided a practical solution. They were officially recognized, taxed, and in many cases considered a necessary institution for maintaining the order of Roman life. But were brothels really the good old days of sex work, as some might nostalgically claim? Far from it. While they were legal and tolerated, brothels were not places of luxury or pleasure for the women who worked there. The reality of being a prostitute in an ancient Roman brothel was far from glamorous. Women working in these spaces were often slaves, forced into the trade by their masters, or they were free women with few other options. For many, prostitution was not a choice. It was a desperate means of survival. The work itself was physically demanding. A prostitute's job in a brothel was far from a one-off encounter with an eager client. It was a repetitive, exhausting process. Many women worked long hours, entertaining multiple clients a day, each transaction stripping away a bit more of their personal dignity and autonomy. They had to endure the whims of men, many of whom didn't see them as anything more than an object of desire to be used and discarded. But despite the lack of respect and the physical toll, the brothels continued to function, essential part of Roman life that offered a way to control and contain male desire. So were brothels a necessary tool for managing men's urges? In a way, yes. Roman society understood the natural desire of men for sexual release, but it was also aware that these urges needed to be controlled, especially within the confines of marriage and family life. Brothels allowed men to satisfy their needs without disrupting the moral and social order. Prostitutes, particularly those in the lower-end establishments, became a controlled outlet for male sexuality, an essential service for a society that valued order and propriety above all else. But were they truly the good old days of sex work? Hardly. Despite the relative acceptance of brothels, They were not places of empowerment for the women who worked in them. Even though the Roman state saw sex work as a necessary part of society, it did little to provide real protections for the women involved. Prostitutes were often seen as morally corrupt and were frequently ostracized, even as their services were crucial to maintaining Roman social norms. They had few rights, little control over their bodies, and were subject to the whims of both their masters and their clients. Their lives were governed by the unspoken social contract that granted men the privilege of indulging in their desires while leaving women to bear the physical and emotional costs of that indulgence. Roman brothels, while necessary to the fabric of Roman life, were far from places of equality or respect. They existed to serve a purpose in a male-dominated society that placed little value on women beyond their utility. Prostitutes were caught in a system that exploited their bodies for the satisfaction of others, offering them little more than survival in return. Despite the fact that brothels were a legal part of Roman life, the reality for those who worked in them was grim, marked by exhaustion, exploitation, and the constant threat of disease. In the end, the so-called good old days of Roman brothels were far from ideal. They were institutions that reflected the stark inequalities and rigid power structures of Roman society. While they may have been a solution to the problem of male sexual urges, they were also a mechanism for the continued subjugation of women. For the prostitutes who worked in these spaces, their lives were defined not by freedom, but by the daily grind of survival in a world where their worth was measured by their ability to serve the desires of others. The brothels may have been necessary, but they were hardly a glamorous or even humane solution for those caught in the system. What did the world of Roman prostitutes leave behind for future generations? Were they merely forgotten in the pages of history, or did they have a lasting impact on Roman society? This final segment takes a look at how the legacy of Roman sex work echoes into modern culture. The role of prostitutes in ancient Roman society was far from inconsequential. Though they were often marginalized, degraded, and seen as the lowest rung on the social ladder, they nonetheless had a significant, if often overlooked, impact on the cultural fabric of their time. Their work was not only a physical exchange, but also a deeply embedded element of Roman social and economic life, with reverberations that continue to echo in modern culture. While Roman society certainly didn't place high moral value on prostitution, the industry influenced everything from Roman law to art and literature. The legacy left by these women is complex, marked by both cultural stigma and lasting contributions that shaped Roman society. In terms of economics, Roman prostitutes played a vital role in the empire's functioning. The sex trade, including brothels and street prostitution, was a lucrative business that generated significant revenue. The fact that brothels were legally regulated and taxed by the state shows how entrenched the industry was within the Roman economy. The tax revenues from brothels were used to fund various public services and infrastructure, demonstrating that the exploitation of sex workers contributed to the empire's economic stability. In a sense, prostitutes were helping to prop up the very system that marginalized them. They were a necessary, albeit invisible, component of the Roman economy. Roman sex work also had a profound influence on Roman literature and art. Prostitutes were featured in countless works of literature, often as the subject of satire, drama, and comedy. Writers like Plautus, Terence, and Juvenal used prostitutes as characters in their plays and poems, exploring the nuances of power, sex, and social order. These depictions often reflected the ways in which society viewed sex workers, both as objects of desire and objects of scorn. While these works perpetuated stereotypes, they also contributed to the cultural narrative around prostitution, shaping how future generations would think about sex work. Art, too, was heavily influenced by the presence of sex work in ancient Rome. Erotic imagery, such as frescoes and mosaics found in brothels and private homes, was common in Roman society. These works often depicted scenes of sexual activity, sometimes involving prostitutes, and were viewed as both decorative and celebratory. The art of the Roman Empire didn't shy away from depicting the raw and sensual aspects of life, and the legacy of that art lives on today. Modern museums around the world house Roman erotic art, offering a glimpse into the sexual norms and the role of prostitution in the ancient world. These artifacts continue to spark discussions about the boundaries of art, sexuality, and morality. Despite the prevalent portrayal of prostitutes as objects of lust or derision in Roman texts and art, they also occasionally appeared in a more empowered light. Roman courtesans, especially those in high-class brothels, were sometimes depicted as women who exercised considerable agency. Some had the ability to engage in political or social influence, especially when their patrons were powerful men. These women, though often still seen as fallen, were not without their own networks of power, wealth, and control. This complex representation of sex workers in ancient Rome offers a nuanced legacy that reveals the fluidity of social roles and the potential for women in the sex trade to gain a measure of autonomy, even within a deeply patriarchal system. Prostitution's legacy didn't end in ancient Rome either. The Roman model of sex work, with its complex relationships between sex, status, and economy, influenced later cultures in Europe and beyond. The legal regulation of brothels, the taxation of sex work, and the societal understanding of prostitutes as both necessary and expendable laid the groundwork for similar systems in medieval and early modern Europe. These practices shaped Western attitudes toward sex work for centuries to come, influencing the laws and social perceptions of prostitution in societies all over the world. In modern culture, the Roman legacy of prostitution is still visible, though often in less obvious ways. The notion of the respectable woman, the fallen woman, and the commodification of sexuality continue to shape contemporary discussions about gender, sex work, and morality. Today, debates surrounding the legalization and regulation of sex work, the rights of sex workers, and the social stigma attached to them often echo the conversations that took place in ancient Rome. While the context has changed, the core issues of power, gender, and autonomy remain strikingly similar. Moreover, Roman views on prostitution have left a lasting impact on how sex workers are treated in modern legal systems. Many laws around prostitution still reflect the Roman approach of criminalizing certain aspects of sex work while leaving others untouched. For example, street prostitution in many parts of the world is still criminalized, while brothels are either legal or heavily regulated. This structure mirrors the Roman system, where streetwalkers and lower-class prostitutes were seen as more problematic than those working in legal, regulated brothels. These modern legal frameworks reveal how much the legacy of Roman attitudes toward sex work continues to influence current practices. In summary, while Roman prostitutes may have been viewed as disposable, marginalized figures, their cultural legacy is far from insignificant. Their impact is felt in the realms of art, literature, economics, and law, shaping the way societies think about sex work to this day. The complexities of their existence, the stigma they faced, and the power dynamics in play have continued to resonate throughout history, leaving an indelible mark on both ancient and modern cultures. As we close out our journey into the lives of Roman prostitutes, it's important to take a moment and reflect on the resilience these women showed in the face of unimaginable challenges. Their lives were marked by constant struggles for survival, battling physical, emotional, and social obstacles every day. They lived in a world that offered them few choices and fewer rights, yet they persisted. They navigated a society that both relied on and reviled them, embodying the contradictions of Roman culture. For these women, the idea of love, respect, or true freedom was something almost entirely out of reach. They were used, abused, and often forgotten by the very society that needed them. And yet, despite all of this, their existence formed a part of the very foundation that allowed the Roman Empire to thrive. From the brothels to the streets, they were woven into the fabric of daily Roman life. And while their stories have often been left untold or ignored, their contributions, no matter how grim, cannot be overlooked. So tonight, as you rest in the comfort of your bed, with clean water, personal privacy, and the luxury of choice, take a moment to appreciate the unimaginable difficulties faced by these women. They endured not just physical labor, but a constant battle against the cultural and social forces that tried to strip away their humanity. And as much as we may look back at ancient Rome with awe or curiosity, let's not forget that the women who worked in its brothels lived lives full of suffering, hardship, and survival. Their stories, though often left in the shadows, are a reminder of the strength and endurance required to navigate a world that saw you as both necessary and disposable. Because while the past can be dark and often uncomfortable, it also shows us the perseverance of those who came before us, the stubborn, resilient souls who survived, and in doing so, left an indelible mark on history. And perhaps, in their struggle, we can find the courage to face the challenges of our own time with a little more understanding and empathy for those who are often invisible, but whose lives matter just as much. So as you drift off to sleep, remember that history may be full of hardships, but it also reveals the strength of the human spirit. And the stories of those who came before us, no matter how uncomfortable, are ones worth remembering. Sleep well, and may we all find a little peace in knowing that even in the harshest of times, the will to survive can still endure. Okay? Good night.